Welcome to today's webinar by IISS, the third in our series that examines the impact of COVID-19 on defense and security issues. The first of our series focused on the US, the second focused on Europe and transatlantic issues. Today, our panelists will consider the possible actions by China and the trajectory for China's continued efforts to exert pressure in the Pacific and the ways in which the US and its allies and friends might respond, and how COVID will affect that dynamic in the Asia-Pacific zone. So I'm very, very pleased today that we have three of our exceptionally talented staff here at IISS. None of them are from IISS Americas, but they're all tuned in from our London office. Maya Nawans is responsible for Chinese defense policy and Chinese international military projection of power. She also is an expert on China's digital Silk Road and other issues of the tech military interface. Before joining IISS, Maya worked for the EU's External Action Service, serving as a political office in the EU office in Taiwan, as well as in the EU delegation in New Zealand. Viraj Solanki is a research associate in the IISS South Asia program, where he carries out policy relevant research assignments and supports the program implementation of our dialogues with military and defense officials in South Asia, and he is an expert on India's military strategy and orientation. Finally, we have Yuka Koshino, who is a research fellow on Japanese security and defense policy in our IISS Japan Chair program. She served as a research associate with the Japan Chair at CSIS in Washington, D.C., and also has experience in the private sector with Avocent and with the Asia Group here in DC. So we have a very, very talented and very in touch group of experts. So to kick things off, I'm going to go through a few questions that I have for each of our speakers, and we will run that part of the program for about 20 or 25 minutes. Then we will open up for questions from the floor. Maya, discussion around China's projection of power in the Asia-Pacific region in recent years has been dominated by the Belt and Road Initiative, by Chinese use of economic pressure and coercion, and the increasingly present, capable, and in some ways assertive PLA. So how has COVID-19 impacted Beijing's ability to pursue these means to project power in support of its interests.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the Americas office for organizing the webinar and hosting us virtually at our office across the pond, so to speak. So a big question that I think we can delve into more detail throughout the discussion today, but I think you're right to say that prior to COVID, I think China was in a place of confidence. We saw multiple efforts of using economic coercion to kind of pursue its interests abroad. We saw an expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative and various infrastructure projects around the world, with a high point around 2017 and a downturn around 2018-19. And we saw the PLA, of course, growing just in capability, but not in numbers, of course, but streamlining and becoming more efficient, practicing real world combat capabilities. COVID impacted China at the start of the pandemic and epidemic in China itself quite heavily. So there's an economic downturn. There was a distrust in the government. Central government had more trust than regional and local governments, but that, of course, was also to some extent carefully handled by the central government. And I think China really wasn't operating from a place of strength. So what we've seen since then, throughout the recovery of China's impact from COVID, is that it is, I think, slowly in some ways returning to a place of confidence, but not in all. So I think, first of all, what we saw was an attempt at really engaging with the rest of the world, rebuilding what it saw, or at least managing a crisis of public reputation around the world. And that was done through mask diplomacy post-COVID, but also on the other flip side of that, wolf warrior diplomacy. So there was a carrot and a stick, so to say. Neither, I think, had a real true impact. Mask diplomacy was criticized by a number of countries for being either disingenuous or offering faulty PPE. So we saw a number of countries like the Netherlands return their shipments of masks and other equipment back to China. I think that had a further negative impact on China's global reputation. China's attempts to bully countries through strongly worded diplomatic messaging in Europe, but also elsewhere, I think also didn't necessarily work. The scrutiny of China's responses to COVID hasn't per se changed. There's still a question of how this originated in Wuhan and why it wasn't responded to as quickly as it could have been. And countries like Sweden and the United Kingdom earlier this year have taken measures and policy decisions at home that are contrary to China's foreign policy interests at the moment, namely with regards to Huawei deployment and 5G rollouts abroad. Sweden was one of the worst countries hit by Boris messaging through wolf warrior diplomacy, and yet it just recently decided to ban Huawei and ZTE in its 5G rollout. So not a really good, I think, result at the end of the day. We have seen wolf warrior diplomacy become less noticeable in recent months as it was at the height of the pandemic. I think that has to do with maybe a reflection on its utility, maybe a response to domestic concern from foreign Chinese officials like Madame Fu Ying on perhaps changing China's approach to foreign messaging. But I think it also perhaps has to do with a greater focus on what's going on at home in China and really addressing domestic issues at the moment. With regards to the BRI, as I said, the BRI started slowing down around 2018 and we saw a noticeable impact in 2019. That's a reflection perhaps not just of COVID, but a wider concern about consolidating investments that were pursued in previous years abroad, rather than continuing this mass explosion of opportunistic investments around the world. It could also just be that the portfolio of investment that was desired is more or less complete, but we won't necessarily know that until much later down the line. COVID, of course, has had the negative impact, further negative impact on the BRI in the sense that countries developing countries in particular are now requesting freeze on loan repayments that China and Chinese commercial and public banks can ill afford. And I think this has been a real foreign policy conundrum for the Chinese government, how to maintain in the long term a favorable bilateral relationship with BRI countries, but also in the short term ensure that some sort of repayment system remains in place and that projects don't go wayward. Now, in terms of defense, I would say post-COVID, China has been particularly active for a number of reasons. During COVID, we all pondered whether COVID would have a stalling impact on China's modernization efforts. We found that not to be the case. There was a temporary pause in things like shipbuilding, particularly because that is one of the centers of China's shipbuilding industry for defense is located in Wuhan. Around a number of shipyards there. Training and exercises were temporarily halted, so we saw a drop in those, but those were mainly the bilateral ones. Internal national PLA exercises did continue. And in terms of power projection, we saw some sort of testing of boundaries with drills and maneuvers in the South China Sea. And of course, as Yuka will attest to, in the East China Sea. In the post-pandemic situation, we've seen China's defense technological and industrial base really pick up the pace. That has been promoted by the assistance from the central government, but also the insistence from the central government to continue development of capabilities. And just this month, we've seen the launching of a number of new surface vessels. Training and exercises, as we've all seen in recent days and months, has picked up significantly, and most of them, if not an overwhelming majority, are really focused on a Taiwan scenario. I think the cross-strait tensions at the moment are a cause of concern. The PLA Air Force and PLA Naval Aviation aircraft are conducting near daily exercises across the median lines in the Taiwan Strait, exercising sometimes towards the north of Taiwan, sometimes towards the south, mostly towards the south, and sometimes simultaneously the north and the south. So there's a real, I think, signaling effort that's happening at the moment towards Taiwan, but of course also towards the United States, which has in the past few months announced several arms sales or intentions to sell arms to Taiwan. Again, in the South China Sea, I don't think we're seeing a cooling of relations or of the situation, stabilization of the situation. I think it's more of the same. The PLA projecting continued power through exercises, but also maneuvers to, again, hold on to that claim of territorial integrity for China in its islands in the Spratlys and the Paracels.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Let me turn to Yuka now. So we've had, it's about 6 weeks since the leadership transition in Japan, with Prime Minister Suga replacing Prime Minister Abe Shinzo upon his retirement. And there's been a lot of talk about what Suga will do on the external side and looking for signals as to intent. So a couple of days ago, Suga-san was on a visit to Vietnam, and in Vietnam, he talked about Japan's role in the region as an Indo-Pacific nation. What does that mean? And is it a sign of continuity with Abe? And is it significant that he made these remarks in Vietnam, which is one of the Southeast Asian states that has a less than convivial relationship with China. Yuka?
Right. Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you everyone listening to this conversation for joining us today for this discussion. So I would like to start from Prime Minister Suga's kind of messaging and intent. So before going to Prime Minister Suga's visit to Vietnam and Indonesia, I would like to highlight the second foreign ministers meeting between India, US, and Australia, Japan, the Quad, the so-called Quad ministers meeting, which was held in Tokyo earlier this month, was the first diplomatic debut for Prime Minister Suga, and also that sends signal that the new administration is going to continue with what the Prime Minister Abe has laid out. Basically, it's the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. But at the same time, and while this had a lot of coverage across media all over the world, the real commitment that Prime Minister Suga made for its Indo-Pacific vision is really his visit to Vietnam and Indonesia, and also the statement that Prime Minister Abe would like to contribute to regional security, stability, and prosperity as an Indo-Pacific nation. So that was the first time that Prime Minister Suga made a very formal commitment to the region. Also, it's significant to emphasize the fact that this is to reassure the region that ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is a critical partner for Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, which often gets mixed up with the kind of military, more America's DoD focused strategy in the region. So Japan has been always trying to emphasize this principle of inclusiveness and openness. Inclusiveness in terms of eventually Japan doesn't rule out the potential for China to even engage in this concept, in the rulemaking concept. So, I want to also elaborate the strategic importance of this visit. So yes, Prime Minister Abe also made his first foreign visit to Vietnam back in when he assumed office in 2012. But the operating environment for the Suga administration has dramatically changed. So his visit has a more significant strategic meaning. So first of all, it's a physical visit to the region, to these countries, even during the coronavirus pandemic. That's a big commitment, especially with the limited options that Japan also has while it struggled to manage its COVID-19 economic and health situations domestically. Secondly, there's increased challenges to the regional stability amid the ever-intensifying US-China strategic rivalry, which has accelerated under the pandemic. And thirdly, a relatively more longer trend under the Trump administration, which is the declining US commitment in the region, especially compared to the previous Obama administration, including skipping some summit or high-level meeting to the region. So against the backdrop of Prime Minister Suga's visit to the region was actually the high expectations from the region's strategic elites, including government officials, industry stakeholders, and experts for Japan's more active role in the region's stability. So Southeast Asian governments in ASEAN and stakeholders have pretty much expressed that they don't want to choose between US or China in this rivalry, and ASEAN, they wanted to maintain ASEAN centrality and unity for the regional stability and regional order building. And so there has been polls and surveys have suggested that there's high expectation for Japan to serve as an alternative or the third strategic partner in the region. Though the similar poll surveys and data shows that Japan's actual influence in terms of strategic and economic has been perceived quite limited compared to China and the United States. So the statements and some of the outcomes from the visit, including defense equipment and technology transfer agreement between Vietnam and Japan, and the kind of put emphasis on cooperation in maritime space, and also statements and agreements to add momentum to the Japan and Indonesia bilateral defense cooperation, including including hosting the second 2+2 meeting, or also moving forward with the discussion on the defense equipment and technology transfer, is a good sign that there's a possibility that the Suga administration would step up further in the security challenges. But at the same time, making these big commitments also means that the Suga administration will be facing high expectations, and whether the administration can follow up with these expectations would be a key for success for his administration's regional policy. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Juka. So interesting. Viraj, India, unlike China and unlike Japan, India is currently facing a massive challenge from COVID and is second only to the United States, and or perhaps is sort of equal to the United States now in terms of daily infections. At the same time, it is facing rising tensions with China, particularly on their border, with not fully defined border in several zones, including in the Himalayas, and the incident of a couple of months ago in which 20 Indian soldiers were killed. So how is the Modi government handling this dual challenge?
Thanks, David. Great to be with you, and great to thanks to our audience for joining today. I think this is it's a really difficult moment for the Modi government. As you mentioned, India is currently the second worst hit COVID country in terms of cases of infections. And I think it's in the unfortunate position of being poised to overtake the US as the world's worst hit country by the pandemic in terms of cases of infections. And India was seeing around 100,000 new cases a day. I think that's come down now to around 55, 60,000. So that's one big challenge for India at the moment. And this comes really at a time when tensions between India and China are high on their land border, on the line of actual control in Ladakh. And China also expanding its presence and influence across the Indian Ocean region through its Belt and Road Initiative. And the India-China clashes on the line of actual control in the Galwan Valley and Ladakh in June of this year are really significant, and the worst clashes in 45 years, and the first time that Indian soldiers have died on the Sino-Indian border in 45 years. So India is really having to deal with a more assertive China, both on its border physically, as well as a rising presence and influence of China across the Indian Ocean region because of the Belt and Road Initiative. However, this is a dual challenge, but India's primary challenge at the moment, I think, especially in the short to medium term, is dealing with the health impact of the pandemic and ensuring a strong economic recovery. And this will really be the main focus of this government, because the Indian economy has been severely hit by this pandemic. In the financial quarter from April to June of this year, India's economy contracted by 23.9%, which is a record. The International Monetary Fund now expects India's economy to contract by 10.3% in financial year 2020-21, which would make it the worst hit amongst all major powers, and it will result in India's first annual recession since 1980. And this follows India growing by only 4.2% in financial year 2019-20, which was its slowest pace in 11 years. So resultingly, there are estimates that over 140 million people have become unemployed as a result of the pandemic in India, and as many as 200 million people could slip back into poverty in India. So this is a massive challenge for the Modi government, and the Modi government needs to ensure that India has an economic growth rate of about 8 to 8.5% to ensure that it can provide 12 million new jobs for everyone, for these 12 million new workers entering the workforce each year with such a fast growing young population. Whereas contrastingly, the IMF predicts that China's economy will grow by 1.9% in this financial year. So therefore, with this dual challenge, we have COVID really impacting India's economy, but also impacting India's ability to deal with the second part of the challenge, which is an increasing challenge from Beijing, which is because there's going to be a projected, if the IMF prediction holds, a 12.2% economic growth rate gap between India and China in this financial year, which is staggering. So this will likely widen the already large gap between the two countries. And I think to address some of these capacity constraints, especially on dealing with the increasing challenge from Beijing, India will likely engage in more issue-based partnerships with like-minded countries and enhance defense and security links, both in South Asia with neighboring countries and across the Indo-Pacific. And as you've mentioned, based on these converging interests, India will likely strengthen security links with the Quad group of countries, Australia, Japan, and the US, who met foreign ministerial level earlier this month. I think we've seen an expansion of that with the announcement of the Australian Navy's participation in this year's Malabar naval exercise, which comes after a gap of 13 years when Australia last participated in 2007. And we're really seeing a strengthening of India's bilateral relations with each of these countries. So the India-US relationship has really strengthened in the last few years. The India-Australia and the India-Japan relations have also done the same. And then we're seeing these partnerships develop both at the trilateral level with India, Australia, and India, Australia, and Japan, and India, Japan, and the US hold trilateral meetings, and also at this quadrilateral level. But I think alongside this partnership, really to deal with this dual challenge of pandemic on one hand and this increasing challenge from Beijing, the Modi government really needs to ensure a strong economic recovery. And I think the IMF predicts that India's economy will be the fastest growing major economy in the next financial year, about 8.8% economic growth. But this Modi government, it's going to be very difficult, but this Modi government really needs to ensure that India has consistent annual economic growth rate levels of over 8%. I think India last achieved this in 2010, so it shows the large gap and what is really needed to be able to counter the challenges resulting from the pandemic, but also that will, having this strong economy will enable it to counter China more effectively as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Viraj. Just one more round of short follow-ups, and then we will open up the Q&A to the floor. Maya, I want to pick up on your comments on Taiwan. So there's been some concern in U.S. defense and security circles that China might perceive an opportunity in the context of the U.S. Being weakened by COVID, and particularly if there is uncertainty around the election, the presidential election result, and that's hanging in the air, that China might perceive that as an opportunity to undertake a political, if not military, effort to sort of restore control by the central government in Beijing over Taiwan. Is there a risk here, or is China really looking at Taiwan and Taiwan reunification over a longer time frame?
I think that's a really important question. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to dive into that a bit more. I think there's always a risk. At the end of the day, the CCP has made clear that by 2049, to achieve the China dream, reunification with Taiwan will be necessary. Now, would President Xi Jinping like to see this happen in his lifetime? Yeah, I think he probably would. So interim date that I think we should keep in mind is probably around 2035. And the reason that I say that is because that is when the PLA is meant to be able to fight modern wars in real combat scenarios, at least regionally. It has a regional focus as deadline. And the PLA is really meant to have accomplished its modernization reforms and efforts by then. On the other hand, I think at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of action that should be seen as signaling and warnings to Taiwan and the United States not to pursue independence. But I don't think that this is, I don't think what we're seeing is China getting closer to making that decision to take Taiwan by force just yet. The reason I say this is because the PLA, for all its improvements and for all of its efforts at having trained for a Taiwan scenario, is still not fully modernized, still not capable, I think, of just attacking the island. Sure, a blockade might be possible, but it's really the intervention of outside forces, mainly the United States, but at the moment, considering geopolitical tensions, other regional forces as well, that I think means that the risk calculation for Beijing hasn't changed. We have to understand that reunification from the CCP's perspective with Taiwan is a make it or break it moment. And when that decision is made, it will be made, I think, either on the basis of feeling like that is the absolute last opportunity to make it happen. So a declaration by Taiwan, for example, of independence would, I think, spark a serious response from Beijing, a military one at least. But I think that's unlikely to happen. President Tsai has been pretty consistent with her attempts to maintain a status quo of some sort across the strait. I also think that then we're looking at another scenario where Beijing either has to be completely confident, 100% confident that it can not just attack Taiwan or blockade Taiwan militarily to force it into some sort of reunification, but we'll have to be able to hang on to Taiwan successfully, regardless of whether the US or others intervene. So that has to be 100% guaranteed, or it has to be a situation where they feel threatened enough to fear losing an opportunity in the future. And I don't think we're there yet at all.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Yuka, I'd love it if you would talk to us a little bit about some of the key defense spending and prioritization themes that you've been following, and you know, what is Japan's military capability to meet the security challenges from China in the East China Sea, despite the fact that Prime Minister Abe was not able to achieve his goal of changing the constitution. It does look like Japan has enhanced its military capabilities to a not inconsiderable amount. Can you comment on these issues?
Yes, I would be happy to. So first, maybe just going back to what former Prime Minister Abe has done over the last 8 years. There were some major institutional developments and also focus on upgrading the US-Japan alliance. I wanted to highlight that before I get into the specific details of the defense capabilities. But this is significant. So first is the setting up the National Security Council and setting up its own national security strategy for the first time in 2013, which approves the interagency coordination even between the defense ministries and foreign ministries, but also improves the alliance coordination with the United States to have better coordination mechanism with the National Security Council. That's one thing. And then second, although Prime Minister Abe was not able to change the constitution, revise the constitution, there were some significant developments in terms of taking out some of the barriers for Japan to play a greater security role to defend itself, but also to cooperate with allies and partners, like the reinterpretation of the Constitution in 2014, which allows a limited collective self-defense and allows a further support role for US operation in the region. And also there was a political kind of investment to pass the 2 security bills that allows Japan to play these security roles. And then also in terms of the US-Japan defense cooperation upgrade, the 2015 upgrade of the guidelines has now allowed the 2 countries to cooperate even further in the new domains like space, cyber, and electromagnetic spectrum, which is a priority areas now for Japan to really focus on its challenge from China. So now the 2018 defense strategy that Japan has released, the defense program guidelines, is really a key that highlights these new areas, new domains, space and cyber, and achieving superiority in space, cyber, and electromagnetic was really emphasized in that defense strategy. And if you look at the defense budgets and spending since then, and also the new budget request that just came out several weeks ago, really highlights the further priority in this area. So Japan's challenges right now, immediate challenges, the security challenges from East China Sea and the Nansei Island, the southern islands. It's really around the Chinese approach on the mix of kind of hybrid warfare on cyber, electromagnetic warfare, and the more traditional maritime challenges and missile defense. So Japan's current defense spending efforts is really to try to build a US-like multi-domain structure for its military. But, and it has, for instance, setting up the new units for the space domain mission unit that is dedicated for the space situational awareness and allows a further information cooperation between the US and beyond the US, including some countries in the Five Eyes. And cyber, it's also going to step up its effort to build and expand its cyber defense units. And also there was just an announcement that Japan is going to set up new 3 units dedicated for electronic warfare for the Nansei Islands. But funding and budget and capabilities are not just what Japan has to deal with. It still has the constitutional limitations and political constraints to change the legislation that will, for instance, allow Japan's more active role and use of limited offensive capabilities in cyberspace, which is becoming increasingly important. So another challenge that Japan faces is really the challenge for this very small funding for R&D and military relevant technologies, and also the shrinking of the public R&D funding itself for dual use technologies, not just for the military, but also on the commercial side. So these are the challenges that the Suga administration would need to deal with going on forward.
Great, thank you very much. Viraj, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how the Modi administration sees the relationship between its military responses to Chinese pressures on their contested borders versus the response in other in other domains, particularly limiting the scope and scale of Chinese companies, particularly tech companies and Chinese apps, to operate in India.
Thanks, David. Yes, so on one hand, we've seen a robust military response by India to China as a result of these clashes and rising tensions over the last few months on the border. And I think we're seeing a real change in perception, in thinking in India, both publicly and politically now. So we're seeing a real change of attitude towards China. So militarily, I think there's been a robust response, as I mentioned, and then India has really, I think, settling in now, I guess, for the winter in terms of these India-China clashes on the border, because tensions have not been reduced significantly, and the talks that are ongoing between both the military side and the diplomatic side haven't resulted in a substantial disengagement and de-escalation between the two countries. But on the other side, I think we're now starting to see a change in the Modi government's policy approach towards China. Previously, I think you could compartmentalize the cooperative nature of the relationship. So mainly China being India's largest trading partner, and also some other elements, including China and India cooperating together to train diplomats in Afghanistan, for example, from the more competitive elements, which is tensions on the border. But now I think we're really going to see the more competitive elements outweigh the more cooperative elements within the Modi government's thinking. So you've seen this in the response from the Modi government in terms of banning apps banning Chinese apps, so TikTok and others. I think it's banned over 100 apps in total. There's talk of, I don't think it's been formalized yet, but of not allowing Huawei to participate in India's 5G, and also steps about restricting the number of Chinese entities in academia and universities. So I think there has been now steps taken, and I think going forward we will see, especially in the short term, medium term, we will see these more competitive, I think, elements of the relationship outweigh the more cooperative elements of the relationship. And I think the public mood in India is probably gearing towards that at the moment as well. But I think we have to be mindful that a lot can change, and India-China rapprochement in the next year or so is not impossible, because this time last year, plus or minus 2 weeks, Modi and Xi were and in Chennai, yes, with the second India-China informal summit. So I think that's changed. I know a lot has happened since then, including killing of Indian soldiers on the border and an officially unacknowledged number of Chinese soldiers. But I think I don't think we should rule out a medium to longer term rapprochement between two countries. I don't think it's fundamentally negative now, and China does still remain India's largest trading partner. But just one thing finally, I think on the current aspect, if we go back to 2017, when India and China were clashing in the Tri-Junction in Bhutan and Doklam, that was really came to an end because Modi and Xi were able to meet at the sidelines of the BRICS summit.
Right.
And the instructions came from the highest level, and then tensions slowly reduced from there. But this time, I think things are slightly different because of the pandemic and these virtual meetings. Modi and Xi, on these big bilateral summits, they've not had the opportunity to meet on the sidelines. So I think next month there's a G20 meeting, ASEAN meeting, BRICS meeting, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which Modi and Xi will participate again. But because these are all virtual, there will be no chance for a color-side meeting between the two leaders. And so there is a slight diplomatic opportunity lost there to reduce tensions from the highest level. And so I think in the short term, because of these, because of the situation, probably competitive elements will continue to linger more and outweigh the cooperative elements. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. So I'm going to open it up to the floor. I have William Anderson, who I'm going to call on first, and then I have several of you have written down questions. I will call on you to address our panelists orally with your questions. So let me start with William.
Yes, good morning. I find this to be a very interesting and very enlightening conversation we're having. My question is, are we seeing an increase in challenges with neighboring countries around China? Are we seeing an increased challenge of them sort of submitting to coercive activities? Are they kind of still on the fence as to whether or not they're going to be fully engaged, supportive of U.S. efforts and U.S. and partners' efforts, or are they still so tied to China's influence that it's increasingly difficult to get commitments from them?
Great question. Before turning to our panelists, let me just say, if you would like to ask a question, if you hit the participants button at the bottom of your screen, you can then raise your hand across from your name in the list that shows up on the right. And so that would be the easiest way to get into the queue for asking questions. I see Joel Cowan has done this very rapidly. Helene, excellent. So let me turn to our panel, and let me start with Maya, and then we'll see if the other panelists would also like to take a shot at William's question.
Thank you for that question. I think it really depends on which countries you're talking about. I mean, when it comes to countries in the Indo-Pacific in general, we have seen a pushback to China and China's coercion tactics. I mean, Australia has been extremely public in calling out Chinese efforts of trying to use the bilateral trade relationship to coerce Australia either into doing things or not doing things, such as calling for an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 virus in Wuhan. Other countries like India have, as Viraj so succinctly described to us, taken measures not just in response to the border clash that we saw a couple of months ago, but also I think just in wider terms, in response to the competition that they see continuing with China, and the banning of some Chinese apps in India was a noticeable, I think, kind of step change in responses here, but one I think that was necessitated by the loss of lives on the border rather than just a simple clash or a scuffle. Of course, Chinese investment in India's tech sector and in India's digital economy continues. So we shouldn't see the ban of 50 mostly social media related apps as an overwhelming complete 180 change to the relationship in tech between China and India. But I think what's also interesting now in India is it's, and maybe Viraj can talk about this a little bit later, the more openness towards a more military engagement and security related engagement with actors like the US. And I wonder whether, whether that is a change in its neutrality or its stated neutrality and non-alignment. Most notably to me, I think most interestingly, was the latest decision or a prospective agreement between the US and India on the exchange of satellite data for intelligence and defense purposes. But other than that, I mean, in the region, we have seen certain statements come out of regional actors in Southeast Asia. The difference here is that these are countries that have in the past, and I think will continue into the future, believing in a balanced and the necessity of a balanced approach to its relationship between China and India. I don't think they just cave to Chinese coercion. I think in some cases, and in the majority of these cases, these are measured policy decisions to continue both working with the US and China and trading with both in order to find some sort of balance. I don't think these countries feel that they are in the position to choose one or the other either way. And I don't think that that's going to change even in a Biden administration.
Thank you. Viraj.
Thanks, David. Just to follow up on Maya's points, I think, yes, we are seeing pushback from countries, as Maya mentioned, notably India towards China's actions, but also some pushback within smaller Indian island states, notably Maldives, which has been quite vocal towards the current Maldives-China free trade agreement, for example, and the negative aspects of this. And I think there are discussions within Maldives at the moment, I think, about just not implementing this free trade agreement and we've seen increasing ties between India and the Maldives resulting. But I think just on Maya's point, we are seeing deepening security and defense links between India and major Indo-Pacific powers, notably the US. We're seeing next week's the two defense and foreign ministerial meeting taking place in Delhi. There's been maritime exercises that have taken place in the last few weeks, a cyber dialogue, defense cyber dialogue that started between the two countries. So we're seeing a real strengthening of India's security and defense relations with both Indo-Pacific powers and countries in South Asia, because this, I think, defense and security is one aspect where India does have an advantage over China, especially in terms of India's engagement with its neighbors on the security and defense aspect. But I think what we need to be mindful of as well is that even though India is enhancing its defense and security links with each of these major powers, I don't think we're seeing India still professes to have a policy of strategic autonomy. I think that will continue, and India will engage in what its former foreign secretary called issue-based alignment. But I think we need to be mindful that whilst the security and defense links are being enhanced because of the pandemic, India's economic ability to engage with these countries is going to be reduced. So there used to be the opposite, where India was having a strong and fast-growing economy, but was more hesitant to engage on the security and defense aspects. But now it's turning to be the other way around, where India is willing to engage on the security and defense aspects, but as a result of this pandemic, it may not be able to compete in the engage as it would like to due to its financial situation. Thanks.
It's a really interesting observation at the end there, Viraj, that there's been a bit of a flip between the strategic and the economic. I think it's a really interesting point. Yuka, do you have any comments on this?
Sure. Maybe I can speak a little bit on the Japan's perspective on China's ties with China's economic links that Japan has with China. I think I would like to reiterate Maya's point about how different countries have different approaches, and also this is not a challenge that has just emerged because of COVID-19, but has been a decade-long challenge. Japan probably have experienced this quite in the early stage around 2012 when there was the incident in the Senkaku Island, the ship collision, and when the Japanese government did not release under the captain of the ship, China responded by temporarily halting the rare earth export to Japan. Well, rare earth is critical, very engine of the Japanese manufacturing industry. So that was kind of the realization in Japan that there needs to be kind of like a strategy on the Japan side to deal with this. And also the realization that China is willing to use these economic coercive tactics to use its economic power. And 2010, around that time, was also when China surpassed Japan's economy as the world's #2 country. So COVID-19 in a way also revealed that some of the strategic goods were also heavily dependent on China, like medical equipments, generic drugs, and also even semiconductors and these important parts of the technology industry as well. And so because Japan had that lesson, I think it was also quite quick in terms of government's move to subsidize companies shifting out production or creating another production line outside of China into both bringing back to Japan, but also allocating some funding for ASEAN to help the regional economic connectivity, which has always been Japan's economic goals. And I would also like to mention that there might be two new drivers over the past year because of COVID-19, but also because of the US-China strategic rivalry that has kind of shifted countries to think about their approaches on reducing economic dependency from China. So one is COVID-19 that I just explained, but second is really the kind of US Trump administration's tough approach on export control, like the control on semiconductor exports or any technologies that has US technology inside it. That also creates risk for many countries, although they value the economic relationship with China, that the future, if the United States goes further to strengthen its export control, their economy might be hit hard, or their industry might be hit hard. So some of the initiative that Japan is trying to do, I think, is really because the China's assertiveness in the region, especially during the pandemic, has also kind of created momentum for regional countries to build a regional coalition, not just a Quad, but also tying countries together. And one of the examples could be bringing this bilateral or Japanese kind of own approach on supply chain resilience to the regional level, like the regional supply chain initiative that Japan, Australia, and India has launched, and also connecting that to ASEAN, Japan-ASEAN supply chain resilience initiative, and creating this regional network, not just for the pandemic or emergency situations, but also to probably, there would be a strategic purpose behind that to reduce dependency on China.
Really interesting points, Yuka. Let me now turn to Alejandro Pescador. If we could unmute him. Amy, can we unmute Alejandro?
Sorry, David, might have to come back to Alejandro.
Okay, that's fine. Francis Hoffman.
Okay, I think I can be heard now. Thank you very much for this wonderful series, David. Very much enjoy it. My question from Washington is about our alliance architecture. I think the U.S. position in Asia is very dependent upon its allies, both in an economic sense and a political sense, and in framing and sustaining any kind of order in the region at all. China appears to target this in the economic domain very heavily, but also in the political and informational domain. I think they're trying to, attack the cohesion of this architecture and separate the United States from Japan. Clearly, I think economically with South Korea, And we also see a lot of influence against both Vietnam and the Philippines collaborating with the United States or with the Quad or anybody else in that region. I'd like to know what our experts might see this competition evolving in the near term, and what they might expect perhaps a change in administrations to do first, perhaps both in the security and in the economic domain.
Great question, Francis. Really key question. Let me turn to Yuka first on this.
Okay. I guess I'll make maybe one brief comment about, yes, China's tactics has been to undermine the alliances, which has been more kind of bilateral approach historically. But at the same time, I would also underscore the fact that probably the most significant security threat for the region is really if US decides to pull out from the region. So I would say that what a new Biden administration would do first, and maybe switch that question to what a Biden administration should probably need to do is to reassure its regional commitment, and also reassure the countries, because under the Trump administration, there was, especially under Japan and the United States, a very clear framework to cooperate under the shared vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, which is not so much military, but shared economic visions actually on infrastructure, digital connectivity, and energy. So whether or not a Biden administration would continue that framework or continue a similar framework, which is takes a more holistic approach than just the military, but also in the economic field, would probably be the priority, which is expected to the new administration.
Can I just make one comment on this? And it's going to be a really interesting one to watch. I think there is this expectation among America's friends and allies in Asia that should Vice President Biden get elected, he will sort of reassure Asian allies that not only is the US concerned with countering China, but the US is committed to the alliance structure and the partnership structure it has in Asia. Now, at the same time, I do think that there is a hope on the Asian side that might lead Vice President Biden to reconsider the U.S. decision to stay out of the CPTPP, the TPP-11 agreement that was finalized under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe after the U.S. pulled out. So Biden himself has said that he's not going to even think about any new trade agreements until things can be put back in order domestically. And I think there's been in my discussions with Biden's advisors, they've really downplayed the notion that the U.S. might return to TPP. On the other hand, the strategic logic of Biden's own approach, I do think will put this on the agenda. So it's going to be a quite interesting thing to watch here. But I do think that Vice President Biden will move to sort of reassure Asian friends and allies about the continued commitments of the United States. President Trump, interestingly, did a ton in Asia, including individually with all sorts of countries, but he never made that kind of regional commitment to allies and partners because he has just a very different viewpoint of partnerships and alliances and is skeptical among them. And it's a paradox, I think, in Trump's behavior. But other comments? Maya, do you want to make a comment on this?
Yeah, thank you. I think Mr. Pescador is absolutely right to say that allies and partners in the region have been very concerned about the Trump administration's behavior and commitments. I think at the last Shangri-La dialogue, it was fascinating to see, and this is not the first time that this has happened, that Asian participants from Asian governments rather asked the question of, do your words match your actions? Because sometimes they don't. And that is the same criticism that China gets, of course, as well. The transactional nature and transactional approach to alliances and security commitments and guarantees, I think has been very disconcerting. So I agree with Yuka entirely that a Biden administration will likely seek to reassure even greater with words and then perhaps later with actions, hopefully, that the US remains committed to Taiwan, to Japan, and to others. I think the problem here that a Biden administration might face is it is likely to base its foreign policy on norms and values. And to some Asian partners and allies, that might not be the best approach or the most palatable approach, because there are differences in norms and values between countries in the Asia-Pacific and Southeast Asia, for example, a whole variety of types of democracies. In some cases and in some countries, the death penalty is still in place. So norms and values might not be the most cohesive way to pursue, to bolster these alliances and partnerships and friendships. So I think there's a concern from the region at what that approach is going to really be based on, and how the Biden administration will be able to maneuver these differences between itself and partners and allies.
Let me ask Viraj to follow up on Maya's response here. I mean, there's been, particularly in some Democratic Party circles, a lot of criticism of Prime Minister Modi's Hindu nationalism, and I'm wondering if Modi is worried about the direction of the U.S.-India relationship if Biden comes in on these values issues.
Thanks, David. I don't think the Modi government is worried about a potential Biden administration. I think India had strong relations with each of the previous four vice presidents since Bill Clinton. So I think fundamentally, whether it's a Trump administration, second term of the Trump administration, or a new Biden administration, the India-US partnership will remain strong, and India will remain a key part of the US Indo-Pacific policy. But as Maya said, potential Biden administration's focus on norms and values could lead to more tricky aspects becoming more prevalent in the India-US relationship. So that's particularly on human rights issues, for example. So as we saw, I think when President Trump visited India in February, it was during the time there were violent clashes going on as a result of India's Citizenship Amendment Act. And in New Delhi, there were riots going on whilst President Trump was in Delhi. But during the press conference, Trump really avoided this question or that was raised of these riots and protests. So I think if that was a President Biden there, that would be a different story. So I think these issues could really become more prevalent. We've also seen, I think, India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar, when he was in the US, he refused to meet one of the Democratic, I think, senators because of things she'd said about India's position on Kashmir. So I think these issues could rise in the bilateral relationship, which would cause some issues, I think. But overall, relations, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. I think the India-US relationship, premised on a strong security defense cooperation, will remain a strong partnership, although issues could come up.
Thank you. Alejandro, can we get you now? Are you able to speak? I'm going to give him 5 seconds to see if we can get him. If not, I'm going to read his question. Okay, so Alejandro's asking the question, China's COVID-19 vaccine has not yet been proved to be safe and effective, but Beijing has already promised to distribute the vaccine along the New Silk Road as part of its promise of an enhanced health Silk Road. If the vaccine works, it will be a valuable achievement in geopolitical terms, but if it fails, it could be a disaster for the Chinese Communist Party. Any comments about this from the panelists? Let me start with Mia on this one. A great question.
Speculation about a vaccine is always a great idea. I would largely agree with your question and the view in your question, Mr. Pescador, that a vaccine that's exported that doesn't work will be terrible for China's public relations, and a vaccine that's exported that does work and is exported well and able to actually target populations that need it in BRI countries would be a plus. But on the other hand, I don't see, we are so early on in this stage that we can talk about a vaccine being developed in China and what stages it's in, but we really, I think, don't have any clear sense of how production is going to go and how fast that will happen and how the rollout will happen to BRI countries and within BRI countries. So I think there's just too much speculation here, but if it goes well, it's a win. If it doesn't, it's not. I think that's the only thing I can say.
Now, what's interesting to me here, Maya and Alejandro, is I think there's a second risk here for China. So certainly exporting a failed vaccine would be a total disaster. But the second risk is that China has been way out in front saying that it is going to give access to other countries of any vaccine developed in China. Yet I have a hard time imagining that China won't be very, very eager to utilize the vaccine domestically overwhelmingly. And it's a lot of people to vaccinate. So I think there's a real risk here that China has raised expectations on the distribution of a vaccine that will be effective when in fact, I'd be very surprised if the overwhelming utilization of a new China-produced vaccine isn't domestic. Maya, any comments on that?
No, I think you're absolutely spot on.
Yeah. Helene Baggart.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I was just wondering, in terms of Europe's perspective, and especially the role of France as a Asia-Pacific power, we've seen this increasing focus from President Macron with his Asia-Pacific focus, and also because of France's overseas territories. How do you see the future role as France, especially in terms of sort of balancing a very delicate tightrope without, becoming just attached to the US mechanically?
It's a great question. Thank you, Helene. Any comments? Yuka?
Yes, I guess there's various roles, diverse roles that France can play in the region. There has been, in the defense side, there has been some cooperation to uphold a rule-based maritime order in the region and some joint exercises between regional maritime powers. But maybe some of the things that might not be highlighted in the discussion around the space is France's role in space cooperation in the region. So for instance, I mean, France is a space power, and Japan also, for instance, made a releases its own space strategy it's also going to pursue a space power. And there has been some ongoing discussion bilaterally between France and Japan on space, but not just bilaterally, but recently there has been, space is one of the areas where there has been some multilateral cooperation in this region. I guess one of the example would be joint exercises. I think it was a Schreiber's game where there's a Five Eyes country and then Germany, Japan, France cooperating if reportedly a situation when the US Pacific Command's GPS system is not going to function, how these countries are going to supplement the capabilities and enhance resilience in this operation. So I guess France's role doesn't have to be geographically limited, but also in the new domain and the key domain, because Indo-Pacific itself is the hot space right now in the world in terms of geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges. Another probably area, I think Francis Macron was also very vocal about the risk of receiving, for instance, Chinese mass diplomacy during COVID-19 seemed like he was quite sensitive in terms of the economic dependence on economic relations with China. And as I have mentioned, the Indo-Pacific concept and Japan's or Australia's, for instance, Indo-Pacific region, India also is an inclusive vision, which has expanded to include issues like supply chain resilience and economic security. So I also see France playing a role in that place.
Can I broaden this question a little bit? In a recent survey, the Pew Research Center surveyed attitudes towards China and towards Xi Jinping in 14 countries, most of which were in Europe. And the findings were really stunning that the favorability ratings in Europe towards China have been plummeting, and towards the credibility of Xi Jinping as a global leader have been plummeting simultaneously. So what do you think that might mean? And I'm looking at Maya here in terms of Europe's relationships with China over the coming years.
So maybe I can address both the previous question and your question, David. With regards to the previous question and the Indo-Pacific strategies, I mean, the two are very related. I think it's interesting to note that, yes, Germany has an Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's a 70-page long document or something like that that has a lot of detail. But on the other hand, it's not as, I think, matured yet as that of France. So there is a difference here in the two approaches. Germany is still very much focused on trade, very much focused, I think, in that document on building relations with India, with Southeast Asia, which were mentioned a majority number of the times, I think. And I think Germany, whilst taking a tough line on China, an increasingly tough line on China, is still interested in trade with China and pursuing a more balanced, again, the word balanced relationship with the two. What I think Germany and some other countries in Europe are doing is one, within NATO, pushing for a greater focus on building or deepening partnerships with countries in the Asia Pacific. What I think has also happened is an awakening, I guess, to the China challenge recently. Prior to 2018, we wouldn't really have heard much criticism of China out loud. That has obviously shifted. But I think there's a lot of soul searching going on at the moment within Europe, where countries are waking up to what's happening in China or the challenges that China poses, but also starting to realize how they have gotten into a certain position or relationship with China due to that previous lack of awareness. And I think that clearly plays out in the investment screening and export control sphere, whereby you now have a European Union that hasn't released a new strategy since 2019 on China, and we thought that that might happen with a new commissioner, but it hasn't. It still considers China, yes, a systemic rival, which was new language for the European Union to adopt, but again, still in line with 3 other different types of relationships that it has, and those are largely cooperative and partnerships with China. So there's it's 1 out of 4 labels that's quite negative from the European Union's perspective. In Europe, some countries look more favorably towards their relationship with China than others. Again, that plays out in investment screening, I think. The European Union passed a regulation that all member states had to establish or strengthen existing investment screening regulations by the end of this month. So that's in about 9 days time. To date, 6 member states still have not made any steps towards creating an investment screening regulation, that mechanism in their country. And have said that actually trade and being open to trade from anywhere on anything is important to them. Others have, since COVID, strengthened their investment screening mechanisms, mainly because they're afraid of aggressive mergers and acquisitions and Chinese poaching of European industry, using this as an opportunity. So I think overall there is a more clear-eyed approach, but there's still no uniformity, there's still no unity in this approach. We have a number of actors that are interested in becoming or playing a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, some more mature than others in their plans.
Thank you. For our last question, let me turn to John Dowdy.
Good morning, and thank you very much for today's call. My question is for Viraj. Amidst the pandemic, it appears that China has gained access to a naval base in Cambodia. What steps has India taken to really bolster its naval force posture? And do you think that China has gained a strategic position over the Strait of Malacca with access to this naval outpost? And I guess lastly, will the string of pearls continue to expand largely unfettered?
Great question. And let me turn first to Viraj, and I would ask each of the panelists to speak for 1 or 2 minutes and have this, combine this with your final comment here as we're coming towards the end of.
Thank you.
Coming towards the end.
Thanks, David, and thanks, John. On the part of India's naval posture, I think we are now going to see, I think, an increased strain on India's defense budget, and within that, India's naval modernization plans, because within India's defense budget at the moment, I think the Indian Navy only gets around 12% of the whole budget in terms, and then overall, the capital acquisition budget for India is only around 1/4 of the budget. So I think the pandemic will have an impact negatively on the Indian Navy's long-term force level plans, and also its ability to expand as it wishes in terms of aircraft carriers, etc. But I think the question in terms of India's, the Strait of Malacca and the strategic base, I think this base, China obviously has its base in Djibouti as well. So I think India is, I don't think it fundamentally changes a lot for India. India is in itself actually negotiating, has negotiated logistics support agreements with Japan, the US, and Australia and others at the moment, which gives it reciprocal access to territories within the Indian Ocean and beyond. So I think that for India generally, I don't think this is this is a major change. And I think that in terms of the string of pearls, as you mentioned, I think India has taken steps already to try and counter China's rising influence within the Indian Ocean island states. So I think this will continue, and India will actively seek to try and enhance its own links with each of the countries within the island, within these island nations. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Yuka.
Thank you. I guess I'll just make some comments to wrap up my points. So first is, it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for the great questions. It's fascinating to see how this topic, which the description was focused a lot on military, but we talked a lot about various kinds of issues, which shows that the challenges from China is not just military, but multidimensional. And probably the thing that I couldn't really touch in my comments about Japan's, how Japan's trying to deal with these challenges is another area is economic security challenges that Japan is trying to step up. And I just wanted to make some comments on that. So as Maya has just mentioned about Europe's approach and dilemmas between US, China, and regional, and the how to deal with China. Japan also, although China has become the challenges from security from China has been increasing, but still for Japan, China is an important economic partner. So navigating that differences is going to be a challenge for Japan, but not just for Japan, but all the countries in the region, in Europe, even in the United States. So there's a need for multilateral or plurilateral cooperation in this sphere. Now, so just final comment on what the next administration, either the existing administration continuing or a new Biden administration will come into power, is really that that the US commitment, especially in the context of the Indo-Pacific region, the US commitment in the region is very important for regional security and prosperity. And also to understand the sensitivities around each country's relationship with China is critical. And so what kind of messages that the next administration will send and what kind of tactics that they are going to use is going to be the key to whether whether the United States can utilize its alliances and partnership and multilateral institutions in the region. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Yuka. Maya, the final word to you.
Thank you. In terms of the base, I'd like to see more progress before we actually become overly concerned about this. I think it's quite a recent realization or development. So let's see what happens. In terms of the string of pearls, I'd also like to see more progress on and more definitive progress on what happens to Gwadar and how the PLA might utilize that. But I mean, China is building a blue water naval force, and that will require basing or access to facilities abroad in the future. I think the question is when that will really materialize, not necessarily if. For the moment, from the PLA's perspective, I think, and from Chinese leadership's perspective, there's a lot happening at home still in terms of military modernization and efforts at focusing on building a future warfighting capability. And so for what I will be looking at for the next couple of months and indeed years is how China seeks to pursue military civil fusion, efforts further, and what that might look like in the next 14th five-year plan that will be announced next year. So there's a lot happening domestically, which makes me at the moment not necessarily worried too much about what's happening more globally, though it is, of course, something that we have to be cognizant of. And maybe just as an end note, a last comment, a bit on the Chinese perspective, I think, on the US elections and also on what a serious negative development might be for China in terms of its foreign and security policy. And the first one on the elections, I think both Biden and Trump will present their challenges to Beijing. Trump in the short term, in terms of his unpredictable nature in the bilateral relationship, but actually in the long term, probably manageable. Biden, on the other hand, is stable, would be a stable relationship, return the US-China relationship, I think, to a stable one, if not entirely friendly one. But in the long term, of course, it presents a greater challenge to China. Now, why? Because of coordination with partners and allies. And I think what happens between extra-regional countries that have Indo-Pacific strategies in place now or are seeking to build those, put those in place, what happens between the US, Europe, and countries in the Indo-Pacific in terms of coordinating their responses to the challenges they view from China will be, I think, the most important development in the next year or so, because the last thing that China really wants at the moment is a coordinated effort against it.
Those are great comments from all three of you. I want to thank our terrific panel, Yuka Koshino, Viraj Solanki, Maya Nowens. I know we can't give them a round of applause that they can hear, but thank you so much. I want to thank our participants and attendees for terrific questions. I thought this was an excellent session. It will be accessible on the IISS website in a couple of days. And with that, this brings our series on the impact of COVID on budgets, military budgets, and national security issues and challenges to a close. And I wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day and a good weekend for those of you who can take tomorrow off. Bye-bye now.